The morning sun painted the castle walls golden as Captain Marcus Thornfield adjusted his armor for the third time. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from exhaustion. He had been awake for 36 hours straight, monitoring intelligence reports about unusual movements in the northern forests. Something was coming, though nobody could say exactly what. Marcus had served the royal family for 15 years, starting as a young recruit who could barely hold a sword properly. Now, at 34, he commanded the elite guard unit responsible for protecting the castle and its surrounding villages. His weathered face bore scars from countless battles, each one a story of survival and dedication to his duty. The castle courtyard buzzed with morning activity. Servants hurried between buildings carrying supplies, while younger guards practiced their sword work under the watchful eyes of senior officers. Children from the nearby village often came to watch the training sessions, their faces pressed against the iron gates as they dreamed of becoming knights themselves. Among these regular visitors was a small girl named Elena, barely 7 years old. Her parents worked in the castle kitchens, and she spent most days wandering the safe areas of the fortress. Elena had bright green eyes and curly brown hair that never seemed to stay in place, no matter how many times her mother tried to braid it. She possessed an infectious laugh that could lighten even the darkest moods among the guards. Marcus had grown particularly fond of Elena over the past year. She reminded him of his younger sister, who had died of fever when they were children. Elena would often approach him with questions about his armor, his sword, or the horses in the stable. Her innocent curiosity and fearless nature both charmed and worried him. She had no understanding of the real dangers that existed beyond the castle walls. On this particular morning, Elena sat on a wooden crate near the training grounds, watching the guards practice their formations. She wore a simple blue dress that her mother had sewn from leftover fabric, and her feet swung back and forth as she observed every movement with intense concentration. Occasionally she would clap when a guard executed a particularly impressive maneuver. Marcus noticed her there and walked over during a brief break in training. "Good morning, little one," he said, his voice gentle despite his imposing appearance. "What brings you to watch us train so early today?" Elena looked up at him with those bright green eyes and smiled. "Mama said I could watch before I help in the kitchens. I want to learn how to fight like you do, Captain Marcus." He chuckled softly and knelt down to her eye level. "Fighting is serious business, Elena. It's not a game or something to take lightly. We train hard because we have to protect people like you and your family. But what if bad people come and you're not there?" she asked with the straightforward logic that only children possess.
"What if I need to protect Mama and Papa?"
The question struck Marcus more deeply than he expected. In truth, there had been increasing reports of strange creatures and hostile groups moving through the outer territories. The kingdom's scouts brought back disturbing stories of attacks on remote farmsteads and traveling merchants. Something was stirring in the dark places of the world, and everyone could feel the tension building like storm clouds on the horizon. "You let the grown-ups worry about protecting everyone," Marcus said, reaching out to gently pat her head. "Your job is to be a child, to learn and grow and be happy. That's what we're all fighting to preserve." Elena nodded seriously, though Marcus could see she wasn't entirely satisfied with his answer. She was an intelligent child who picked up on the subtle changes in mood around the castle. Even at her young age, she sensed that something was different lately, that the adults seemed more worried and spoke in hushed tones when they thought children weren't listening. As Marcus stood to return to training, a horn sounded from the watchtower. It wasn't the regular horn that announced meal times or shift changes. This was the deep, urgent blast that meant danger was approaching. Every guard in the courtyard immediately stopped what they were doing and looked toward the tower. A second horn blast confirmed everyone's fears. The signal meant hostile forces had been spotted within a day's march of the castle. Marcus felt his stomach tighten as he realized that all those intelligence reports and sleepless nights of preparation were about to become reality. "All guards to your stations," Marcus shouted, his voice carrying easily across the courtyard. "Secure the outer gates and begin evacuation procedures for the village." The courtyard erupted into controlled chaos as guards ran to their assigned positions. Servants began moving valuable items to the inner keep, while stable hands prepared horses for potential evacuation or battle. The well-rehearsed emergency procedures kicked into motion like clockwork. Elena sat frozen on her crate, watching the sudden transformation of the peaceful morning into urgent preparation for conflict. Her eyes were wide with confusion and growing fear as she tried to understand what was happening around her. Marcus quickly returned to her side. "Elena, I need you to go find your mother right now. Stay in the kitchens and don't come outside until someone tells you it's safe. Do you understand?" She nodded silently, but he could see tears forming in her eyes. Without thinking, he pulled off one of his leather gloves and handed it to her. "Keep this safe for me, and I promise I'll come get it back from you when this is all over." Elena clutched the glove tightly against her chest and ran toward the kitchen entrance, her small feet pattering across the stone courtyard. Marcus watched her go, feeling a protective instinct surge through him that was stronger than anything he'd experienced in his years of service. Little did he know that within hours, that protective instinct would be tested in ways he never could have imagined. The approaching threat was unlike anything the kingdom had faced before, and Elena would find herself at the center of events that would change both their lives forever. As Marcus hurried to join his men on the castle walls, dark shapes moved through the distant forest, and ancient evils that had slumbered for centuries began to stir with hunger and malevolent purpose. The reports from the scouts were worse than anyone had feared. Captain Marcus stood in the war room with the other senior officers, studying maps and listening to testimonies that seemed to come from nightmares rather than reality. The creatures approaching the castle weren't ordinary bandits or enemy soldiers. They were something far more dangerous and mysterious. Lieutenant James Crawford, the kingdom's best tracker, had returned just an hour earlier with information that made everyone's blood run cold. His usually steady hands shook as he pointed to locations on the map where attacks had occurred. "They move like nothing I've ever seen," James reported, his voice hoarse from riding hard through the night. "They don't make camps or leave normal tracks. It's as if they flow across the land like shadows. The few survivors we found could barely speak, and those who could manage words described creatures that seemed part animal, part something else entirely." Sir William Blackstone, the castle's head strategist, leaned forward with deep concern etched across his weathered face. "How many are we talking about, Lieutenant? What kind of numbers are we facing?" James shook his head grimly. "It's impossible to get an accurate count, sir. They move in small groups that seem to coordinate without any visible communication. But based on the pattern of attacks and the territory they've covered, I'd estimate we're facing at least 200 of these things, possibly more." Marcus felt his heart sink. The castle's guard numbered only 150 men, and many of those were young recruits with limited combat experience. They had trained for battles against human enemies, not creatures that defied normal understanding. "What about their weaknesses?" Marcus asked, though he suspected the answer wouldn't be encouraging. "Did the survivors mention anything that might help us defend against them?" "Fire seems to slow them down," James replied after a moment's hesitation. "And they appear to avoid areas with running water. But Captain, these things are fast, intelligent, and they seem to know exactly where they're going. I don't think they're just randomly attacking settlements. They have a specific target in mind." The room fell silent as the implications of that statement settled over everyone. If these creatures were moving with purpose rather than simply destroying everything in their path, it meant they were hunting something or someone specific. The question was what they wanted and why they were heading directly toward the castle. King Edmund himself entered the war room at that moment, his presence immediately commanding everyone's attention. Though in his 50s, the king remained an imposing figure with broad shoulders and keen gray eyes that missed nothing. He had ruled the kingdom for over 20 years, through wars, famines, and political upheavals, but Marcus had never seen him look quite so troubled. "Gentlemen," the king said, his voice calm but carrying an undertone of deep concern, "I've been in communication with our allies in the neighboring kingdoms. Similar attacks have been reported across a wide area, all following the same pattern. These creatures appear to be searching for something, and their search has led them here." Marcus stepped forward. "Your Majesty, what could they possibly be looking for in our kingdom? We have no ancient artifacts or magical items that would attract such attention." The king was quiet for a long moment, seeming to wrestle with some internal decision. Finally he spoke, and his words changed everything the guards thought they knew about their situation. "There is something I have kept secret for many years," King Edmund said slowly. "Something that only a few trusted advisors have known. Hidden in the deepest vault beneath this castle is an artifact of immense power, something that has been in our family's protection for generations. I believe these creatures can sense its presence and they are coming to claim it." The revelation hit the room like a thunderbolt. Marcus felt his mind racing as he tried to process this information. An ancient artifact of power, hidden beneath their feet all these years and now drawing supernatural enemies to their door. What kind of artifact, Your Majesty? Sir William asked, his strategic mind already working on the implications for their defense. The heart of Ethros, the king replied, and several of the older officers gasped in recognition. A crystal of pure magical energy that was created by the ancient mages thousands of years ago. Legend says it has the power to grant its wielder control over life and death itself. My ancestors swore an oath to keep it hidden and safe from those who would use it for evil. Marcus understood now why the creatures were so determined to reach the castle. If even half the legends about the heart of Ethros were true, it represented power beyond imagination. In the wrong hands, it could bring about the destruction of entire kingdoms. We cannot let them reach it, Marcus said firmly. Whatever these creatures are, whatever power they serve, we have to stop them here. The king nodded gravely. I know I'm asking a great deal of all of you. This is not a normal battle we're facing. But if the heart falls into the wrong hands, the consequences will extend far beyond our kingdom's borders. We are the last line of defense between this artifact and forces that would use it to bring darkness across the entire realm. As if summoned by their words, another horn blast echoed through the castle. This time it was the signal that meant the enemy had been sighted directly. Marcus and the other officers rushed to the windows and looked out toward the northern approach. What they saw defied description. Dark shapes moved across the landscape like living shadows, flowing over the terrain with unnatural speed and coordination. They seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, making it difficult to discern their exact forms or numbers. Even from a distance, there was something deeply wrong about the way they moved, something that made Marcus's skin crawl with instinctive fear. Dear God, Lieutenant Crawford whispered. They're even worse than I described. Look at how they move together, like parts of a single organism. Marcus tore his gaze away from the approaching threat and turned to the king. Your Majesty, we need to evacuate the castle immediately. Get the artifact and as many people as possible to safety while we hold them off. King Edmund shook his head. The heart cannot be moved. It's bound to this place by ancient magic. If we try to remove it, the binding will break and release energies that could be even more catastrophic than letting these creatures have it. The trap was now complete. They couldn't flee with the artifact, and they couldn't allow their enemies to claim it. The only option was to stand and fight against odds that seemed impossible to overcome. Marcus looked around the room at his fellow officers, seeing the same determination reflected in their faces despite the fear. These were good men who had sworn oaths to protect the kingdom, and they would not abandon their duty even in the face of supernatural terror. Then we make our stand here, Marcus declared. We hold the walls and protect the people for as long as we can. Whatever happens, we don't let those things reach the heart. As the officers dispersed to prepare their defenses, Marcus couldn't shake the image of little Elena from his mind. She was somewhere in the castle below, probably hiding in the kitchens with her parents, clutching his leather glove and waiting for him to return safely. The thought of those dark creatures reaching her filled him with a rage that burned hotter than fear. The battle for the castle and perhaps the fate of the entire realm was about to begin. The first attack came at sunset, when the failing light created perfect conditions for the shadow creatures to advance unseen. Marcus stood on the main battlements, his sword drawn and ready, watching as the darkness itself seemed to come alive and flow toward the castle walls. The archers had their arrows nocked and ready. Though everyone questioned whether normal weapons would be effective against enemies that seemed to be made of living shadow, Marcus had ordered the preparation of fire arrows and had braziers lit along the walls, remembering the scout's report that fire might slow the creatures down. Steady. Men, Marcus called out to the guards positioned along the wall. Remember your training. Stay together, watch each other's backs, and don't let fear cloud your judgment. We've faced difficult enemies before. But even as he spoke those words of encouragement, Marcus knew this was unlike anything they had ever faced. The creatures moved with an intelligence that was deeply unsettling, seeming to probe the castle's defenses for weaknesses rather than launching a direct assault. They flowed around the base of the walls like water, searching for vulnerabilities. Lieutenant Crawford appeared at Marcus's side, his face pale but determined. Captain, they're not attacking the main gate like we expected. They seem to be looking for another way in. Marcus nodded grimly. He had noticed the same thing. Normal armies would focus their assault on the weakest points in the fortifications, But these creatures were behaving differently. They moved with purpose, as if they knew something about the castle that the defenders didn't. "Send word to all sections," Marcus ordered. "Double the watch on every entrance, including the old drainage tunnels and maintenance passages. If these things are as intelligent as they seem, they might know about access points we've forgotten." As if responding to his words, a guard's cry of alarm echoed from the eastern wall. Marcus and Crawford ran toward the sound, their boots pounding on the stone walkway. What they found there made Marcus's blood run cold. Several of the shadow creatures had somehow scaled the 30-foot wall without using any visible means of climbing. They clung to the stone like liquid darkness, their forms shifting and flowing in ways that defied natural law. The guards at that section had fired arrows at them, but the projectiles passed through the creatures without effect. "Fire arrows!" Marcus shouted. "Light them up!" The guards quickly ignited their specially prepared arrows and fired them at the climbing shadows. This time, the effect was immediate and dramatic. Where the flaming arrows struck, the creatures recoiled with sounds like screaming wind. They didn't fall, but they did retreat, flowing back down the wall like spilled ink. "It works," Crawford exclaimed. "Fire does hurt them." But even as they celebrated this small victory, Marcus realized they faced a terrible problem. They had a limited supply of fire arrows, and the creatures were testing the defenses at multiple points simultaneously. If they had to use fire at every section of the wall, their ammunition would run out quickly. More horns sounded from different parts of the castle. The creatures were probing everywhere, learning the layout and testing the defenders' responses. Marcus felt like he was playing a deadly game of chess against an opponent who could see moves ahead of him. "Captain," a young guard named Thomas came running up, his face flushed with exertion and fear. "There's been a breach in the outer courtyard. Some of those things got through the drainage system near the stables." Marcus's heart sank. If the creatures had found a way into the outer areas of the castle, it was only a matter of time before they reached the inner keep where the civilians were sheltering. He had to make a difficult decision about where to focus the defense. "Crawford, take 20 men and secure the outer courtyard," Marcus ordered. "Use fire wherever possible. I'll hold the main wall with the remaining forces." As Crawford led his team down into the courtyard, Marcus positioned his remaining guards along the most critical sections of the wall. The shadow creatures continued their probing attacks, sometimes withdrawing when faced with fire, other times seeming to test how much damage the defenders could inflict. In the distance, Marcus could see more dark shapes approaching across the fields. The initial attack was just the beginning. Wave after wave of creatures were moving toward the castle, and his small force of guards was already being stretched to the breaking point. Below in the courtyard, he could hear the sounds of combat as Crawford's team engaged the creatures that had breached the outer defenses. The clash of steel was mixed with other sounds that Marcus had never heard before, inhuman cries and the hiss of fire meeting supernatural flesh. As the night deepened, the attacks intensified. The creatures seemed to grow stronger in the darkness, their movements becoming more aggressive and coordinated. Marcus found himself constantly moving along the wall, reinforcing weak points and rallying his men when fear threatened to overwhelm them. It was during one of these moments, as he helped repel yet another climbing assault on the northern tower, that Marcus heard something that made his blood freeze. From somewhere deep within the castle came the sound of a child screaming. "Elena." The sound cut through all the chaos of battle like a knife through his heart. Marcus knew that voice, had heard Elena laugh and chatter countless times during peaceful mornings in the courtyard. Now she was screaming in terror, and the sound was coming from inside the castle where she was supposed to be safe. "Sir William," Marcus called to the senior officer coordinating the eastern defenses. "Take command of the wall. I have to check something in the inner keep." Without waiting for a response, Marcus ran toward the stairs leading down into the castle. As he descended, the sounds of battle on the walls faded behind him, replaced by an ominous silence that was somehow worse than the chaos above. The corridors of the castle were dimly lit by flickering torches, creating dancing shadows that made Marcus's nerves jump with every step. He moved quickly but carefully, his sword ready and his senses alert for any sign of the creatures that had somehow penetrated their defenses. Elena's scream came again, closer now, from the direction of the kitchens where she was supposed to be hiding with her parents. Marcus broke into a run, his armor clanking as he rushed through the stone passages toward the sound. When he reached the kitchen area, what he found there would haunt him for the rest of his life. The door to the main kitchen had been torn from its hinges, the heavy wooden barrier ripped apart as if it were made of paper. Inside, tables and supplies were scattered everywhere, and there were signs of a desperate struggle. But most terrifying of all, there was no sign of Elena or her parents. The kitchen was empty except for the destruction and a lingering sense of malevolent presence that made Marcus's skin crawl. Another scream echoed from deeper in the castle, and Marcus realized with growing horror that the creatures hadn't just breached the outer defenses. They had found a way to the very heart of the fortress, and they were hunting the people he had sworn to protect. The real battle was just beginning, and it would test not just his skills as a warrior, but his courage as a man willing to sacrifice everything to save an innocent child. Marcus followed the trail of destruction deeper into the castle, his heart pounding with each step. The stone corridors that had once felt safe and familiar now seemed like a maze of danger and shadows. Every flickering torch created dancing shapes that could hide lurking enemies, and every distant sound made him grip his sword tighter. The screaming had stopped, which somehow made things worse. The silence that followed was heavy with dread, broken only by Marcus's own breathing and the distant sounds of battle from the walls above. He moved carefully through the passages, following overturned furniture and gouged stone that marked the creature's path. As he descended toward the lower levels of the castle, Marcus began to understand the true cunning of their enemies. The shadow creatures hadn't broken through the main defenses at all. They had found the ancient tunnels that connected the castle to the underground chambers where the heart of Ethros was hidden. The assault on the walls had been a distraction, drawing the defenders' attention while a smaller force infiltrated through the forgotten passages below. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The creatures weren't just randomly attacking the castle and its people. They were systematically working their way toward the artifact, and anyone who got in their way was being eliminated or captured. Elena and her parents had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Marcus reached a junction in the corridors where several passages met. Here the signs of struggle were more evident. Scratch marks scored the stone walls, and there were dark stains on the floor that he didn't want to examine too closely. But most importantly, he could hear sounds coming from the passage that led toward the old dungeon levels. The sounds weren't quite human, but they weren't entirely inhuman either. They were voices but distorted and changed in ways that made Marcus's stomach turn. Mixed with these disturbing vocalizations, he could hear what sounded like sobbing, soft and heartbroken. Moving as quietly as his armor would allow, Marcus crept down the passage toward the sounds. The walls here were older than the rest of the castle, carved from living rock centuries ago when the fortress was first built. Ancient symbols were etched into the stone, worn smooth by time but still visible in the torchlight. As he rounded a corner, Marcus saw a sight that filled him with both relief and terror. Elena was alive, huddled in a small alcove in the wall, but she was not alone. Standing guard over her were 3 of the shadow creatures, their forms more solid and defined than the ones he had seen on the walls above. Up close, Marcus could see that the creatures were not entirely made of shadow as he had first thought. They had physical bodies, but those bodies seemed to be composed of darkness given substance. Their features were vaguely humanoid but elongated and distorted, as if someone had taken a human form and stretched it like clay. Most disturbing of all were their eyes, which glowed with a cold, intelligent light that spoke of malevolent purpose. Elena sat pressed against the wall, tears streaming down her face, clutching Marcus's leather glove against her chest. She looked so small and vulnerable in that ancient stone alcove, surrounded by creatures that seemed to have crawled out of nightmares. But she was alive, and that gave Marcus hope. One of the creatures was speaking, its voice like the sound of wind through dead leaves. The words were in a language Marcus didn't recognize, but the tone was unmistakably questioning. It seemed to be interrogating Elena about something, though what a 7-year-old child could know that would interest such beings was beyond his understanding. Marcus realized he was facing an impossible situation. There were 3 creatures, and they were positioned so that any direct attack would put Elena in danger. His sword and armor gave him advantages in normal combat, but these were not normal opponents. He had seen how ineffective conventional weapons were against them, and his supply of fire-based tools was limited. But as he watched, Marcus noticed something important. The creatures seemed to be avoiding direct contact with Elena, keeping a careful distance from her as they spoke. And in her hands, his leather glove seemed to be glowing with a faint, warm light that pushed back the shadows around her. It took Marcus a moment to remember the protective charms that all royal guards carried as part of their equipment. His glove had been blessed by the castle's chaplain with wards against evil, a traditional ceremony that most guards considered more superstition than practical protection. But apparently, those old traditions had more truth to them than anyone had realized. The protective blessing was keeping the creatures at bay, preventing them from simply taking Elena by force. But it was also clear that the protection was temporary. The glow from the glove was flickering, growing weaker as the dark magic of the creatures pressed against it. Marcus knew he had to act quickly, but he also knew that a direct assault would likely fail. Instead, he began to formulate a desperate plan that would require perfect timing and more than a little luck. Moving carefully, Marcus retreated back down the corridor until he found what he was looking for. The castle's lower levels had been carved with a complex system of air shafts and drainage channels, designed to keep the dungeons from becoming completely stagnant. Many of these passages were too small for a grown man to use, but they might serve another purpose. Working quickly and as quietly as possible, Marcus began to pile dry materials from the storage rooms into one of the air shafts. Old tapestries, broken furniture, anything that would burn. Then he used his flint and steel to light the pile, creating a fire that would send smoke through the ventilation system. Within minutes, smoke began to pour from openings throughout the lower level. The shadow creatures reacted immediately, their forms becoming less solid as the smoke filled the air. Marcus had gambled that their weakness to fire extended to smoke as well, and he had been right. As the creatures became distracted and weakened by the smoke, Marcus made his move. He charged down the corridor with his sword drawn, not aiming for the creatures themselves but focusing on reaching Elena. The protective blessing in his own armor, similar to the one in his glove, gave him some resistance to the creature's dark influence. The first creature turned toward him as he approached, its glowing eyes fixed on him with hatred and hunger. Marcus didn't try to fight it directly. Instead, he grabbed Elena and rolled with her into another alcove, positioning his body between her and their enemies. "Elena," he whispered urgently. "Are you hurt?"
Can you run?
She looked up at him with those bright green eyes now wide with terror, but still holding a spark of the brave child he knew. "Captain Marcus," she whispered back. "You came for me. I knew you would come." The simple trust in her voice gave Marcus strength he didn't know he possessed. Whatever it took, whatever the cost, he was going to get this child to safety. The creatures might be after the heart of Ethros, but they would have to go through him to harm a single person under his protection. As the smoke continued to fill the corridors and the shadow creatures writhed in apparent agony, Marcus began to plan their escape route. But he also realized that this was only the beginning of their ordeal. The creatures had come to the castle for a reason, and they wouldn't give up easily. The real test of his courage and skill was still ahead. The smoke was both salvation and curse. While it weakened the shadow creatures and gave Marcus the chance to reach Elena, it also made it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. The ancient corridors of the castle's lower levels became a maze of confusion and danger as Marcus tried to navigate while carrying Elena to safety. "Hold tight to me," Marcus whispered to Elena as he lifted her in his arms. "We're going to move quickly, and I need you to stay very quiet no matter what you see or hear." Elena nodded against his shoulder, still clutching his blessed glove. Her small arms wrapped around his neck with surprising strength, and Marcus could feel her trembling with fear and exhaustion. The poor child had been through more terror in one night than most adults experienced in a lifetime. Behind them, the shadow creatures were recovering from the effects of the smoke, their angry hissing echoing through the stone passages. Marcus knew they wouldn't be deterred for long. These beings had come too far and sacrificed too much in their quest for the heart of Ethros to be stopped by such a simple trick. As Marcus moved through the corridors, he began to piece together what had really happened. The creatures hadn't randomly encountered Elena and her parents. They had been specifically searching for someone, and their interrogation of Elena suggested they believed she might have information they needed. It made sense when Marcus thought about it. Elena spent her days wandering through the castle, exploring areas that adults rarely visited. If anyone might have stumbled upon clues about the location of the hidden artifact, it could be a curious child who went places she wasn't supposed to go. "Elena," Marcus whispered as they paused at a junction in the corridors. Have you ever seen anything strange in the castle? Any rooms or passages that seemed different or special? Elena was quiet for a moment, then spoke in a voice so soft he could barely hear her. There's a room with singing stones, she said. Deep down where the old tunnels are. Mama told me never to go there, but sometimes I hear them singing when I'm playing in the storage rooms. Marcus felt his blood run cold. Singing stones could only mean one thing: magical crystals that resonated with supernatural energy. Elena had somehow discovered the chamber where the heart of Ethros was hidden, and the creatures had learned this from her parents before capturing her. The realization changed everything. The shadow creatures weren't just randomly searching the castle. They knew exactly where they were going, and they were using Elena as a guide. If Marcus couldn't get her to safety quickly, she would be forced to lead them directly to the most powerful magical artifact in the kingdom. A new sound echoed through the corridors, cutting through the noise of the smoke and the creatures hissing. It was the sound of marching feet, many of them, moving with military precision. For a moment, Marcus felt hope surge in his chest. Perhaps reinforcements had arrived from the walls above, but as the sound grew closer, Marcus realized something was wrong. The footsteps were too perfectly synchronized, too rhythmic. Human soldiers moved with discipline, but there was always some variation in their steps. This sounded more like the march of mechanical beings, each step falling in exact time with the others. When the figures emerged from the smoke, Marcus saw something that filled him with new dread. They were humanoid in shape, but clearly not human. Their bodies seemed to be constructed from the same shadow stuff as the creatures, but they were more solid, more organized. They wore what looked like armor made of crystallized darkness, and they carried weapons that gleamed with an oily, unnatural light. These weren't the relatively primitive shadow creatures that had been probing the castle's defenses. These were soldiers, warriors from whatever dark realm had sent the attack, and they were moving with clear purpose toward the deeper levels of the castle. Marcus pressed himself and Elena back into a side passage, hoping the smoke would conceal them as the shadow soldiers marched past. But as they passed, one of them stopped and turned directly toward their hiding place. Its face was hidden behind a helm of crystallized shadow, but Marcus could feel its attention like ice against his skin. The shadow soldier raised its weapon, a sword that seemed to drink in the surrounding light, and began to move toward their hiding place. Marcus knew he couldn't outrun these beings while carrying Elena, and he couldn't fight them effectively in the confined space of the corridors. But then Elena did something that surprised everyone, including Marcus. She held up his blessed glove, and it flared with sudden brilliant light that cut through the smoke like a beacon. The shadow soldier recoiled, raising its arms to shield itself from the radiance. "The light hurts them," Elena whispered with excitement. "Just like the fire!" Marcus realized that the protective blessings on his equipment were more powerful than he had ever imagined. The church's ancient wards against evil weren't just symbolic. They were practical weapons against the forces of darkness. Acting on instinct, Marcus pulled off his other glove and pressed it into Elena's hands. "Hold them both up," he whispered. "Keep the light shining." With both blessed gloves in her hands, Elena became like a small sun in the darkness of the corridors. The shadow soldiers fell back, unable to approach the radiant light that surrounded her. Marcus realized that Elena wasn't just a victim in this situation. She had become their key to survival, but the light also made them visible to every enemy in the area. Within moments, more shadow creatures were converging on their position, drawn by the disturbance. Marcus knew they couldn't stay hidden any longer. Their only chance was to keep moving and hope they could reach safety before the creatures found a way to overcome the protective light. "Elena, we're going to run now," Marcus said, lifting her again but making sure she could keep the gloves positioned to maintain their protective radiance. "Can you keep the light shining while we move?" "I can do it," Elena said with determination that reminded Marcus why he had grown so fond of her. Despite her fear and exhaustion, she was showing remarkable courage for such a young child. They began to move through the corridors, Elena's light clearing their path of shadow creatures while Marcus navigated toward what he hoped would be a safe exit. But with each step, Marcus became more aware that they were being herded. The creatures weren't trying to capture them immediately. They were driving them toward a specific destination. The terrible truth became clear as they emerged into a larger chamber deep beneath the castle. They were in the ancient ritual room where the heart of Ethros was kept. And standing before the altar where the artifact rested was a figure that made all the other creatures seem like mere servants. It was tall and imposing, wearing robes that seemed to be cut from the fabric of night itself. Its face was hidden beneath a hood, but Marcus could see eyes that burned with ancient malevolence and intelligence. This was the master of the Shadow Army, the being that had orchestrated the entire attack on the castle, and in its hands it held Elena's parents, alive but clearly under some kind of dark enchantment that held them motionless and helpless. "Welcome, Captain," the figure spoke, its voice echoing strangely in the stone chamber. "I have been waiting for you to bring me the child. She is the final key I need to claim what rightfully belongs to the darkness." Marcus realized they had walked directly into a trap, and the most dangerous part of their ordeal was just beginning. The chamber beneath the castle was unlike anything Marcus had ever seen. Ancient symbols covered every surface of the walls, carved deep into the living rock and filled with a substance that gleamed like liquid starlight. The air itself seemed to hum with power, and at the center of it all stood an altar holding the heart of Ethros. The artifact was breathtaking and terrifying in equal measure. It appeared to be a crystal the size of a man's head, but its surface shifted and flowed like captured lightning. Colors that had no names danced within its depths, and Marcus could feel its power pressing against his mind like a physical force. But it was the figure standing before the altar that commanded his attention. The master of the Shadow Army was tall and gaunt, draped in robes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. When it turned to face them, Marcus saw a face that might have once been human but had been twisted by centuries of dark magic into something alien and terrible. "You are wondering who I am," the figure said, its voice carrying harmonics that made Marcus's teeth ache. "I am Valdric the Eternal, once a scholar of this very kingdom, now servant to powers that transcend mortal understanding. I have waited 300 years for the stars to align properly for me to claim the heart." Elena pressed closer to Marcus, but she kept the blessed gloves raised, their light creating a protective barrier around them. The radiance seemed to cause Valdric physical discomfort, forcing him to maintain his distance even though he clearly wanted to approach. "Let her parents go," Marcus demanded, his hand resting on his sword hilt. "They have nothing to do with this. Your quarrel is with the kingdom, not with innocent people." Valdric laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Innocent? None of you are innocent. You have hoarded this power for generations while the world suffered and died. Wars could have been prevented, famines ended, diseases cured if only your kings had been willing to use the heart's power for the greater good." "And you would use it better?" Marcus challenged, trying to keep Valdric talking while he looked for some advantage in the situation. "I would use it as it was meant to be used," Valdric replied. "The heart of Ethros was created to reshape reality itself, to bring order to chaos and perfection to imperfection. In my hands it will create a world without suffering, without death, without the messy complications of free will." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold stone around them. He had heard this kind of reasoning before, from tyrants and madmen who justified their atrocities by claiming to serve the greater good. Valdric might believe his own words, but Marcus could see the hunger for power behind his philosophical justifications. "The child has seen the heart before," Valdric continued, gesturing toward Elena with one skeletal finger. "She has been drawn to its power and it has marked her. She is the key that will allow me to bypass the protections your ancestors placed around the artifact." Marcus looked down at Elena, suddenly understanding why the creatures had been so interested in her. The heart of Ethros didn't just exist in the physical world. It resonated across multiple levels of reality. Elena's innocent exploration of the castle had brought her into contact with its influence, creating a connection that Valdric needed to exploit. "I won't let you use her," Marcus said firmly, drawing his sword despite knowing how ineffective it had been against the shadow creatures. "You have no choice in the matter," Valdric replied. "Look around you, Captain. My servants surround this chamber. Your protective light can keep them at bay for now, but the power in those gloves is finite. When it fails, you will surrender the child or watch her parents die slowly and painfully." As if summoned by his words, shadow creatures began to emerge from hidden alcoves around the chamber. They moved carefully, avoiding the light from Elena's gloves, but their presence made it clear that escape was impossible. Marcus counted at least 20 of them, with more probably waiting in the passages beyond. But as Marcus studied the situation, he began to notice something important. The creatures weren't just avoiding Elena's light. They were also carefully avoiding certain areas of the chamber itself. The ancient symbols on the wall seemed to create patterns that the shadow beings couldn't cross, forming invisible barriers that divided the room into safe and dangerous zones. The original builders of this chamber had designed it as more than just a hiding place for the heart. It was a fortress, with magical defenses that were still active after all these centuries. If Marcus could understand the pattern, he might be able to use it to their advantage. Elena tugged on his armor to get his attention. When he looked down, she whispered so quietly that only he could hear. "The singing stones are moving, Captain Marcus. They're getting louder." Marcus listened carefully and realized she was right. The humming sound that filled the chamber was growing stronger, and he could see that the symbols on the walls were beginning to glow more brightly. Something was activating the chamber's defenses, but he couldn't tell if it was responding to their presence or to Valdric's dark magic. "Time grows short," Valdric announced. "The convergence of celestial forces will reach its peak within the hour. Surrender the child now, and I will allow you and her parents to leave with your lives." "No," Elena said suddenly, her young voice clear and strong in the ancient chamber. "You're a bad man, and Captain Marcus doesn't make deals with bad men." Valdric's eyes flared with anger at being defied by a child.
"Very well.
"If you will not cooperate willingly, I will take what I need by force." He raised his hands, and dark energy began to gather around his fingers. The shadow creatures started to move forward, testing the boundaries of Elena's protective light. The blessed gloves were indeed growing dimmer, their power slowly failing under the sustained assault of dark magic. Marcus knew they had perhaps minutes before their protection failed completely. He had to act, but direct confrontation with Valdric and his army would be suicide. Instead, he focused on the one advantage they might have: his knowledge of the castle and Elena's mysterious connection to the heart itself. "Elena," Marcus whispered urgently, "you said you've heard the stones singing before. Can you hear where the song is strongest?" Elena closed her eyes and listened intently, her small face scrunched in concentration. After a moment, she pointed toward a section of the wall where the symbols seemed to be carved more deeply than elsewhere. "Over there," she whispered. "That's where the prettiest music comes from." Marcus looked at the area she indicated and saw something that made his heart race with sudden hope. The symbols there weren't just decorative. They formed a pattern that looked suspiciously like a control mechanism. If he was right, the ancient builders had created a way to actively control the chamber's defenses. It was a desperate gamble, but it was the only chance they had. As Valdric continued to gather his dark power and the shadow creatures pressed closer, Marcus prepared to risk everything on the hope that 300-year-old magic would respond to a desperate soldier's touch. The final confrontation was about to begin, and the fate of not just Elena and her parents, but possibly the entire kingdom hung in the balance. Marcus moved toward the wall section Elena had indicated, carrying her carefully to maintain the protective light around them. The shadow creatures followed their movement like predators stalking wounded prey, but they couldn't cross the barrier of blessed radiance that surrounded the child. As they reached the wall, Marcus could see that his guess had been correct. The symbols here were different from the decorative carvings elsewhere in the chamber. They formed a complex pattern of interconnected circles and lines that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. At the center was a handprint carved deep into the stone, sized for an adult human hand. "What are you doing?" Valdric demanded, his voice sharp with sudden concern. "Step away from that wall immediately." The urgency in the dark sorcerer's voice confirmed that Marcus was on the right track. Valdric knew what the symbols meant, and he was afraid of what might happen if they were activated. "Elena, I need you to keep the light steady," Marcus said as he approached the carved handprint. "Whatever happens, don't let go of those gloves." "I won't let go," Elena promised, her voice brave despite the fear in her eyes. Marcus placed his hand against the carved print, and immediately felt a surge of ancient magic flow through him. The symbols on the walls began to glow brighter, and the humming sound in the chamber rose to a crescendo that seemed to shake the very foundations of the castle. "Fool," Valdric screamed. "You don't understand what you're unleashing." But Marcus was beginning to understand. The chamber wasn't just a storage place for the heart of Ethros, it was a testing ground. The original creators had built in safeguards that would activate when the artifact was threatened. The magical defenses were designed to determine who was worthy to approach the heart, and who represented a danger to it. Light erupted from every symbol on the walls, creating a network of brilliant lines that connected across the chamber like a web of pure energy. The shadow creatures caught within these lines of power screamed as they were torn apart by forces they couldn't resist. Even Valdric was forced to retreat toward the altar, his dark robes smoking where the light touched them. But the magical activation had an unexpected effect. Elena's blessed gloves suddenly blazed with renewed power, but now they were connected to something much larger than simple protective charms. She had become a focal point for the chamber's defenses, her innocent presence somehow amplifying the ancient magic. "The stones are singing so loudly now," Elena said with wonder in her voice. "They're happy, Captain Marcus. They've been waiting for someone to wake them up." Marcus realized that Elena's previous visits to the chamber hadn't just exposed her to the heart's influence. They had created a bond between her pure spirit and the protective magic of the place. She wasn't just a key to bypass the defenses as Valdric had believed. She was the chamber's chosen guardian. Valdric raised his hands and unleashed a bolt of dark energy toward them, but the light surrounding Elena absorbed the attack effortlessly. The ancient magic was more powerful than anything the sorcerer could summon, and it was growing stronger with each passing moment. "This is impossible," Valdric raged. "I have studied these magics for centuries. The defenses should not respond to a mere child." "You studied them, but you never understood them," Marcus replied, his own understanding growing as the chamber's magic flowed through him. The heart of Ethros wasn't created to serve ambition or desire for power. It was made to protect and preserve life itself. Elena represents everything pure and innocent that magic was meant to defend. The lines of light on the walls began to converge on the altar where Valdric stood. The dark sorcerer raised his hands to protect himself, but Marcus could see that his power was failing against the chamber's awakened defenses. The shadow army that had seemed so threatening was being swept away like smoke before a cleansing wind. Elena's parents, still held motionless by Valdric's enchantment, suddenly gasped and stumbled as the dark magic controlling them was shattered by the rising light. They looked around in confusion, then saw Elena and began moving toward her. "Elena!" her mother cried out, tears streaming down her face. "We thought we had lost you." But Valdric wasn't finished. As his power failed and his servants were destroyed, desperation drove him to one final terrible act. He placed his hands directly on the heart of Ethros itself, attempting to absorb its power before the chamber's defenses could stop him. The result was immediate and catastrophic. The heart flared with brilliant light, but instead of granting Valdric the power he sought, it began to tear him apart from the inside. Centuries of dark magic and accumulated evil couldn't coexist with the pure energy of the artifact. He screamed as his form began to dissolve, the darkness that had sustained him for so long finally consuming itself. "This cannot be," he shrieked as his body crumbled to ash. "I was so close. I deserve this power." But the heart of Ethros had made its judgment and Valdric's worthiness had been found wanting. In seconds, nothing remained of the dark sorcerer except dust scattered on the ancient stone floor. As Valdric's destruction was completed, the chamber's defenses began to calm. The brilliant lines of light faded to a gentle glow, and the overwhelming humming settled into a peaceful harmonic that filled the space with serenity. Elena's blessed gloves returned to their normal soft radiance, though they remained warm to the touch. Marcus looked around the chamber and realized that the threat was truly over. The shadow army had been completely destroyed, Valdric was gone, and the heart of Ethros remained safe in its ancient resting place. But more importantly, Elena and her parents were alive and unharmed. Elena ran to her parents, who swept her up in their arms with tears of joy and relief. Marcus watched the reunion with a smile, feeling a satisfaction deeper than any he had experienced in his years of military service. This was what he had truly been protecting all along, not just a kingdom or an artifact, but the simple love between a family. "Captain Marcus," Elena called out, turning back toward him while still held in her parents' embrace. "You came back for your glove, just like you promised." Marcus laughed and walked over to accept the blessed glove she held out to him. "I told you I would, didn't I? A promise to you is more important than any other duty I have." As they made their way back through the castle corridors toward the surface, Marcus reflected on the night's events. He had learned that true courage wasn't about facing impossible odds or wielding magical weapons. It was about choosing to protect others regardless of the cost to yourself. The castle above was quiet now. Word had somehow spread that the threat was over, and the remaining guards were securing the walls and tending to the wounded. King Edmund met them in the main hall, his face showing profound relief when he saw that Elena and her family were safe. "Captain Thornfield," the king said formally, "the kingdom owes you a debt that can never be fully repaid. Your courage and dedication have saved us all." Marcus bowed respectfully, but his attention was on Elena, who had fallen asleep in her mother's arms, exhausted by the night's ordeal, but safe at last. The protective light from the blessed gloves had faded, but Marcus could still sense something special about the child, a connection to the ancient magic that would probably stay with her for the rest of her life. In the days that followed, life at the castle returned to its normal rhythm. The shadow creatures were gone. The heart of Ethros remained safely hidden, and Elena resumed her daily visits to watch the guards train. But sometimes, when the light fell just right, Marcus could see a faint glow around her that reminded him that some bonds, once formed, could never be broken. The royal guard had rescued the child, but in doing so, he had discovered something about himself and the true meaning of heroism that would guide him for the rest of his days. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not for glory or honor, but for the simple right of innocent people to live in peace and safety. And sometimes, the greatest magic in the world is the courage to stand between danger and those we are sworn to protect.